We're going to be in the book of Nehemiah chapter 13. Nehemiah chapter 13, verse 10 is going to be our key verse this evening. We have been recently going through a study, off and on, about a small little word called flee. F-L-E-E. We dealt with, really a three-part message about how different parts of it, how Paul and Silas did not flee their cell, but instead stayed in that prison and eventually led not only the Philippian jailer to the Lord, but also led his family to the Lord. Now this evening, as we look at really the last in this series, I believe the last in this series about fleeing. There's another one I don't know that we're going to get to right now. I want to look at a group of people as a whole that fled to their fields. And I want you to know, I'm going to bring up a question this evening. I'm going to ask you a question after you read a verse. And I want you to know this question does not have a black and white answer. In this verse we're going to read here this evening, that we read about the Levites fleeing to their fields. I want you to be thinking to yourself, what would you do in their situation? If the temple of God had been forsaken, and you are a Levite, you are a worker in that temple, what could you do, and what should you do? Now I want you to know there's not necessarily a hard and fast answer to this, but I want to give some principles here tonight about when we're doing the service of the Lord. You see, do you meet on a Sunday? I mean, if we're living our life for the Lord. And yes, if we're serving in church. The Levites were the workers in that temple. They weren't the priests, they were the workers there in that temple, doing a lot of just the basic day-to-day work and the things there of that temple. But these are the people the Levites were the faithful ones. Again, they weren't what you would even be referred to today as the pastor, missionary, evangelist. These are just the faithful people that were trying to serve the Lord. What happens when you're starved out? What happens when you are really don't know what else to do? I want to give some principles here tonight. Look, if you would, at Nehemiah chapter 13, verse 10. It says this. Nehemiah 13:10 says, "And I perceived that the portions of the Levites had not been given them. For the Levites and the singers that did the work were fled, every one to his field." My question that I have for you this evening is this. If there was, again, if it was a lack of funds that was in your bank account, if it was a lack of people to be able to minister to, if it looked like, again, what's the point of doing this service since it doesn't seem like anyone's going to the temple anymore, what would you do? Would you flee to your field? Would you, in a sense here, their job was to be at that temple, but there comes a time and place, again, where someone is asked, what is the purpose of me staying here when the tithes and the offerings aren't being given anymore? And I want to look at that here this evening, but I want to focus on those Levites and those singers. The singers weren't even necessarily those that had to have been a Levite. There were Nethinims, there were different people that sang there, or appointed to sing in that temple. But when it came down to it, again, it didn't look like anyone was giving it. They really weren't. They weren't bringing their tithes and offerings. The place that had been appointed to store their tithes and offerings had been taken and given to somebody else. And there didn't seem to be the people to be able to serve anymore. What does somebody do in that situation? I want to give some application to our life. Before I do that, let's go to the Lord in prayer. Father, I'm looking at a 2,500-year-old instance. But as best I can tell, this really applies for those that want to be faithful to God's house, faithful to his service, faithful in being a servant of you. Father, the best I can tell, these Levites are not what we consider a pastor, a missionary, evangelist, but just the faithful workers there in that temple. Father, I can only ask what you can do, Lord, is that you would, really, first of all, that you would fill me. You say to them that have no might, you increase strength. You say the effectual fervent prayer of a righteous man availeth much, and I claim your righteousness. And Lord, you are my everything. You're still the one that saves. You're still the one that lives. And I pray for the people here this evening. Father, I can fan the flame, and that's what I want to do. A flame, a desire to serve you, to have hope in you, to go forward to you, which is always the place we go forward to. So, Lord, we look to you this evening. In Jesus' name, amen. I just want to bring this out. I want to hammer this out a little bit further, because I feel like I haven't done it yet. When you look at the Levites in this story, this is an Old Testament time, and sometimes when a preacher gets up, or even a Sunday school teacher gets up, we try to make application to who these different characters are in the Bible, and how we can apply that to our lives today. And my fear is that if we look at these people called the Levites and the singers, we'd say, well, that doesn't apply to me. Because after all, if we're going to apply it today, that would apply to more the pastor or a missionary evangelist, someone who's in full-time ministry. And I tell you, that is not the case. These Levites are defined based on what verse 10 says. Look at what verse 10 says again. Verse 10 says, and I perceived that the portions of the Levites had not been given them. For the Levites and the singers that did the work were fled, every one to his feet. This sermon here this evening are for those that do the work. Those that do the work. You say, well, what if I'm not full-time in the ministry, I'm not a pastor and evangelist. Most of all the different tasks that happen in church doesn't happen by the pastor. In fact, most of what we consider our Christian service does not even happen on a Sunday. Our Christian service is when our life is for the Lord. It involves those that we meet in our workplace. It involves our commitment even away from everybody else. They say that character is what you are when nobody's around. It's easy to look good. It's easy to talk about the Lord in front of other Christians. In fact, today's day and age, it's not even becoming as easy. But I will say this, these Levites are for those that did the work. I would say there's a number of people, even though among those singers. These are the ones that did the work. There are those that could have been in this category, but never were. You say, what do I mean by that? I mean that there were thousands upon thousands of Levites out there and singers that this verse would not apply to. Back in this time, it was the shell of a temple of what it used to be. It was still rebuilt. Zerubbabel had come and rebuilt the temple. Ezra had come to restore the worship. And now Nehemiah came to rebuild the walls and have a functioning city there in Jerusalem. And as they're rebuilding those walls, in the midst of that, they have this group of people that Nehemiah had just gone away for a time. He had served for about 12 years. I don't know if it was off and on, but he had basically served for about 12 years. And as he took leave and went back to the king, and then came back to the city again, as they finished rebuilding the walls, came back to the city and found that the temple of God was still in one piece, but it was not being used rightly. And I want you to know that there were so many Levites throughout the whole earth there, throughout the whole Persian Empire, that never did come back to the temple to do their service. They never did. And this couldn't apply to them. These people that I'm looking at, the Levites, I want you to know, I consider them, in my opinion, the cream of the crop. These are the people that wanted to be godly. They chose to come out of all their place and serve God again. Some of them were from some very profitable places. In Babylon, that was Shushan the palace. That could have been a profitable place to be making money or serving different positions. But these Levites left where they were and went to a hole-in-the-wall place. See, what would I mean? Well, there's two places I think of that I've driven through that reminds me of this. Downtown Cleveland or downtown Detroit. I specifically think of downtown Detroit as I had been going through there and was traveling with my dad on the way to something, and he took me over a detour route. And he said, I want you to see, he showed me the technical school that he had gone to a technical school for a couple years and then became a copier repairman after that. And he said, I want you to see the school that I went to. And it was a burnt down place and I'm not being crazy when I say this, but it looked like something that if ever there was drug deals going down, it'd be in this building. And you'd look at the whole neighborhood, it's just neighborhood after neighborhood there in Detroit, and it was just a shell of things. Boarded up houses that you think, this is where dope addicts would be. This would be a terrible place. So that's what it would be like when people came back to Jerusalem. The city was burnt with fire. It was just a shell of itself. It was rubble. And these people were to come and to start making houses. This was the ultimate flipping of the houses because they had to start rebuilding. And so a bunch of Levites came back. A bunch of people, many more than just the Levites, came back and said, we're going to rebuild. We're going to start by going back with the worship. We're going to rebuild the temple. Years and years passed after that. Ezra came to restore worship in the temple. Years passed after that. Nehemiah came to rebuild the walls around the city so they could actually really have a functioning worship, a protection, and people could actually live there and have their families grow up there. And as they're doing this, they had established all this that they had. And if the Lord wills, I will plan to go through the book of Nehemiah at some point. But I want to focus on this evening. These Levites were the cream of the crop. They were those there that would serve in the temple. Hey, listen, this could be anybody that's serving in church today, not just that comes and sits in a pew, but says, look, I want to be part of it. I want to be an encouragement to others. I want to, even outside of this church, I want to call and I want to check on other people and help others that I know. I want to live my life for the Lord. Those are those Levites. It could include, again, you say, were they all the believers? No, I think there were probably other believers out there. And there were certainly other Levites. But these were these Levites here. And when Nehemiah had left, this temple, step by step, started to be forsaken. And as that temple was forsaken, the Levites' job got harder and harder. I want you to see, I want you to know here, the one at fault primarily for this. For the Levites fleeing to their fields and all that, the one at fault primarily was actually the priest. And at one time, he was the high priest. And Eliashib, the high priest, and different things he did. I want you to see what happened to this temple. Look, if you would, at verse 1. Nehemiah chapter 13, verse 1 says this. On that day, they read in the book of Moses in the audience of the people, and therein was found written that the Ammonite and the Moabite should not come into the congregation of God forever, because they met not the children of Israel with bread and with water, but hired Balaam against them, that he should curse them. Howbeit our God turned the curse into a blessing. And it came to pass, when they had heard the law, that they separated from Israel all the mixed multitude. And before this, Eliashib the priest, having the oversight of the chamber of the house of our God, was allied unto Tobiah. And he had prepared for him a great chamber, where aforetime they had laid the meat offerings, the frankincense, and the vessels, and the tithes of the corn, the new wine, the oil, which was commanded to be given to the Levites and the singers, and the porters, and the offerings of the priests. But in all this time was not I at Jerusalem. For in the 32nd year of Artaxerxes, king of Babylon, came I unto the king, and after certain days obtained I leave of the king. And I came to Jerusalem, and understood of the evil that Eliashib did for Tobiah, in preparing him a chamber in the courts of the house of God. And it grieved me sore. Therefore I cast forth all the household stuff of Tobiah out of the chamber. Then I commanded, and they cleansed the chambers, and thither brought I again the vessels of the house of God, with the meat offering and the frankincense. And I perceived that the portions of the Levites had not been given them. For the Levites and the singers that did the work fled every one to his field. Then I contended with the rulers and said, Why is the house of God forsaken? And I gathered them together and set them in their place. Let me just stop right here and say, the most important person at fault, the one that was the most at fault, let me say it that way, the one the most at fault in this chapter was Eliashib, the high priest. And I shudder to think about that, because although this is not a temple, we are the temple of the Holy Spirit. If I'm making application here, I look at myself as a pastor of being, I can't just let what this person thinks or that person think. Here's what we're going to do spiritually or that. Boy, I'm answerable to God. I'm accountable to the people of my church. I should be open to the people of my church, but ultimately, I answer to God. And I shudder to think about this, because none of this, I don't think, would have ever happened had not Eliashib been doing his job. And I think about that, and you say, well, does it really make a difference? I know I'm the pastor, I'm preaching to you all, but I'm just telling you how it is as a pastor. I don't like the fact, and maybe it's, in one sense, it's an encouragement, but I don't like the fact that, boy, if I quit on the Lord, I'm not even talking just quit the ministry. I'm talking if I just say, you know what, I'm done with this Christian thing, and just, I don't see it the way that God sees it, and why be full out for Christianity? If I do that, I think of not only my congregation, but I think of those younger than me. I think of those younger than me that will be very, very influenced in the wrong way. You know that song that we sing, or we don't sing it that often. We have to pass a handout to sing it, but it's Because He Lives. You remember that second verse of that song, how sweet to hold that newborn baby. You know what I'm talking about? The second verse of that song. How sweet to hold that newborn baby. I don't know if I'm doing the words right, but that's the song that I think of. And you know what? He says that baby can face uncertain days because he lives. And if we stop serving the Lord, I want you to know, what chance does the generation after us have? Well, how can we say to them, because he lives, and we don't believe it in our heart? And I go first to myself as a pastor. Oh, it's so important for me as a pastor. It'd be so important that if, I don't know how, I serve in this church as long as God has me to serve. He has not led me anywhere else, but when the next pastor comes, that next pastor should be one that has a responsibility before the Lord, accountable to the people in the sense to be open and listen, and again, to take advice. But the bottom line is, we all stand accountable for God for our choices. And I have a little bit of fear when I look at this, because I see Eliashib, that high priest. I see Nehemiah contending with the rulers, and that is often the case, that when the leadership fails, so do the people. Sometimes you have the leadership doing right, and the people still don't do right. But over and over again, you see in the Bible, how many kings did Israel, the northern kingdom, have that were bad? Every single one of them that we were known. And the people as a whole did not worship God. But in Judah, there were faithful people, and among them there were some faithful kings. And I can say this, is that in any position that we have, whether it be pastor, whether it be as a parent, as a husband, as a Sunday school teacher, as any position where we have a charge or responsibility, there should be a healthy fear. And number one, making sure that we have a love for God, that what we preach and what we teach is not just merely coming from a book or coming from the Bible itself, but is something we want to live. I will say this, that for every pastor, every evangelist, missionary, Sunday school teacher, parent out there, we recognize this. There's all going to be a little bit of hypocrisy. It's going to be that way. We're going to preach on a subject that we know we are weak on. And there's no point in being dishonest about that. But it shouldn't be in the sense where we say, you know what, I'm not going to try. This is just for other people, but not for me. That should never be the case. So I just want to bring this out, that when these Levites fled to their field, the one primarily at fault was Eliashib, this priest, who earlier on is called the high priest. He had made a chamber for Tobiah who was an Ammonite, who God specifically said of the Moabites and Ammonites, not only are they not allowed in this temple, but you're not even to seek their peace or prosperity forever. Now, Ruth was a proselyte, different situation. I don't still think that she would have been allowed there, at least her gender, being allowed to worship there in the temple or tabernacle. But regardless, I look at this as that Eliashib had, the priest gave Tobiah the Ammonite not only a place there, but look if you would at verse 3 again. It says this, "Now it came to pass when they heard the law that they separated from Israel all the mixed multitude. And before this, Eliashib the priest, having the oversight of the chamber of the house of our God, was allied unto Tobiah, and he prepared for him a great chamber, where aforetime they laid the meat offerings, the frankincense, and the vessels, and the tithes of the corn, the new wine, the oil, which was commanded to be given the Levites and the singers and the porters, and the offerings of the priests." So now picture this here. This is what we got here of the priests and of the Levites and the singers and the porters. This is how they got their food. People would bring their tithes. Tithes would be a tenth of what they had got there of their storehouse from what they're, and then they had other special offerings that they would give. Offerings at different times of year that they'd come to bring. And of those offerings that were given, you had certain that would go to the priests, certain sacrifices that would go to the priests. But the bulk of it, the majority of it, would go to these Levites, to the tribe of Levi that were serving there in the temple. And they had a storehouse, a room there. I don't know why I picture it on my right-hand side, but they had a storehouse, a room that they'd store all that there, and huge, probably maybe bigger, maybe as big as this room, I don't know. But a huge storehouse that they store all these things in there. But at that time, Eliashib, the high priest, so what's this for? There's not many, I'm just speculating here, thinking, why bother with this? It's not like the temples that we have other rooms in the temple. Why bother with this room? So he made it for someone that he was allied to. Now we also find out, not in this portion here, but his grandson was married to somebody that was they had Ammonites and Moabites allied to them even by marriage there. His grandson was married to somebody from one of their enemies. And so he made a chamber here for Tobiah the Ammonite. That was the place where the Levites would get their food. I know this is supposed to be for you, but I'm just going to say it for me as a pastor too. I think it's important that, as myself as a pastor, I have to be careful to not say, well, boy, we don't have as many people in church. Why bother doing this or that when maybe it's still a command of the Lord? But maybe it's, even if it feeds just one person, even if just one person needs to be spiritually fed, I, as a pastor, should feed that one person. Now, what about a Sunday school teacher? What about as a parent of just one child? If it's just one person, it's worth it. If it's just one, it's to be our job. Jeremiah had a harder job than any one of us, I think, have or probably ever will have. God said to him, I want you to speak to a people, and they're not going to listen to you, but you speak to them anyway. The only real converts, if you would, that I would say this, was not even of Israel. Daniel received some encouragement. He was of Israel, but Ebed-Melech, the Ethiopian, he wasn't of Israel. And Jeremiah would be an encouragement. None of the people that Jeremiah actually spoke to actually listened. God doesn't say that for us. But even if it was, we should have the attitude, we serve the Lord, ultimately not people. And I put the bigger responsibility on those rulers on Eliashib, the high priest. So before I went any further in this, I wanted to be very open and honest that these Levites had a responsibility, but the primary responsibility rested on Eliashib, the priest. He had the charge of that chamber. And I don't know at that time that he had the charge of the whole house of God, because that wasn't under any one priest or Levite. It was a joint responsibility. And I don't know that he was the high priest at that very moment. There were different times where the high priest would go in at a certain time of year. And it's said that throughout Israel's history, it wasn't always just one person. There would be, this person would serve as high priest, and later on another person would. But here's what I know, is Eliashib had the charge of that chamber. He said, I'm going to give this to Tobiah, God's enemy. Look, if you would, even further in this passage here. Look at verse 10. It says, and I perceived that the portions of the Levites had not been given them, for the Levites and the singers that did the work were fled, every one to his field. Skip, if you would, to verse 12. Then brought all Judah the tithe of the corn and the new wine and the oil unto the treasuries. So let me just bring out a point. I'm talking about what Eliashib did, but I can understand why these Levites would flee to their fields. And what that means is this. Is there the country round about. There were times where they'd have to serve, they'd have to stay there at the temple to serve in their courses. Meaning, by their courses, I'm specifically meaning that they would serve for a certain season, a certain amount of time, then someone else would take their place, and they'd have like a rotation there. But they would still be in charge of serving. They'd have different jobs that they would rotate on, but they'd have to, it's not like they could just go to another city and just come back and forth every day. That's just not the case. It'd be too far. It'd be too much of a responsibility. They couldn't do that there at the temple. So with that said, they fled and they picked a spot in the country and they just continued farming. That's how they got their food. And I understand why they did that. The tithes, according to these verses here, they hadn't been bringing the offerings. What are they going to eat? What are they going to do? And so I understand why they had done that. And it looks like honestly, people weren't even coming. If I'm reading this chapter correctly, earlier on, revival was starting to happen. They're reading the law of the Lord. And it looks like people hadn't even been coming to the temple. And so I can understand why these Levites would make that decision. And so what I want to encourage you is this. Is that if you're someone who, if you determine, I want to go to the work. I want to not only serve in my church, but have a higher calling to, I'm a servant of God in my workplace, in my home. I exist for Him. And it is so easy, if there's ever been a day and age where it is so easy to just slack. I'm not talking about just, grit our teeth and just go forward in anger. I'm talking about just, God doesn't call us to do that, but just to love Him, to cleave to Him. If there's ever been a time where people would just let go of God, I'm not talking about salvation, but just, I'm not going to do what I don't want to be a fanatic about this. Or people just say, I don't want to go all the way. That's today. That's today. If there's ever been a day, that is today, where it's just so easy. You just have to do nothing. All you have to do is just stop going forward and you slide backwards. That's what the book of Jeremiah says when it talks about backsliding. Hosea even mentions the term about a backsliding heifer, that the fact of just like a cow there, you put it on a hill and if it's not going forward, it's going to slide backwards. It's either going forward or backwards. And we do go uphill because that's where God is. God is higher than this. We go to Him. And I'm glad about that. But what I can say is that these Levites, they had an excuse, a reason. And I want to say this, I don't have a hard and fast thing on this. You say, well, the Levites are supposed to serve in the temple. There may have been a time. There may have been a time and place where God could have led some of these Levites to go back to the field, or some of those singers. I could think of those singers specifically. But I would say this, I had to think to myself, what if I were a Levite in their position? What would I do? Would God provide? Even if those tithes and those offerings were going down, could He still provide? Now, obviously, I think you know the answer to that. Of course, He could. What would He do? And I just want to encourage you that when everyone else is quitting, go forward for God. I want to give you 3 people that come to my mind. And you're not going to have to, you probably won't have to turn to these passages. But I want to give you 3 people that may come to your mind. What could, if you were in that position of those Levites, or if you're in your position today, whatever you're doing, whatever your responsibility is, and you should have a responsibility. It should not be when you come to church that I just come to sit in the pew. You should be an encouragement to others. You should do your best to serve other people. You should do your best outside of this church. What do you do outside the church? Well, nothing. Well, that's not why God put us here on this earth. It's not just to do nothing and wait for heaven. That's not the Bible that I'm reading. say, well, I have a job. I do this, I do that. I'm very busy in things. Well, in the busyness that you're doing, is it for the Lord? Is it about, well, Lord, how will you direct me today, Lord? Do I start in his word? Do I take time out to pray in what he wants? I think of 3 people specifically. 3 principles that I can get about the Lord providing even when the storehouse is low. First one I think of is a man by the name of Elijah. Elijah, you remember, was the one that came in front of King Ahab and said there's not going to be any dew nor rain but by my word. And then he left. We find out in the book of James that he had prayed, actually, fervently for that time of drought to happen. He had prayed for that. And so as Elijah had gone, God would provide for Elijah. And I don't know that necessarily we're going to get through all 3 people here tonight. I don't know that I want to try to force that in. But I do think about Elijah specifically. If you were in those Levites' position, would God provide for you? And I do believe that would be the case. I'm not saying that there couldn't be there's never a case to stop serving the Lord. I would be harder on those Levites than I would be the singers themselves. There's never a case to stop serving the Lord. But I can say this, is that if we ever do something, that it's because we think God cannot do it. Or that God hasn't moved us to the next step. God brought us to this point, but hasn't taken us any further, then we stand. We stand strong to what God has given us. To the ministry that God has given, to the people that God has put in our place. Say, Pastor, I'm not that strong. I'm not like other people. It's just standing firm. We stand on him. That's where our firmness comes from, by clinging to him. And I think of Elijah specifically. You remember when he had a time of famine? God was still going to provide for Elijah. And I want to bring this out when it comes to God providing for you, God providing for me. Does God provide? Yes. It's not exactly a way that we would necessarily think. Do you remember the story of Elijah? Do you remember that when he had fled from, and you're welcome to follow along, but I'm going to be jumping back and forth, but I'm referring to 1 Kings 17, but you remember the story of Elijah? That when he had, during that time of drought, that time of famine, that time of no rain, what God specifically told Elijah to do right after that, it says, Elijah, I want you to go hide. Not hide out of fear. It's a specific Hebrew word that means just to be in secret. Don't let Ahab know where you are. I want you to go hide. So that's what he did. And I want you to know that there are times, if we're going to apply and say, Lord, I believe that you're going to provide for me. I'll be honest, when it comes to those Levites, I don't know how they could say that if they're going to say, okay, I've got to provide for myself. I've got to go back to a field. They had families. It's not that they didn't marry. They had families. They had kids. They had to provide for. What are they going to do? If they were in the place where God had called them to, would God provide? And I can say this for you. I can say this for anybody. As we go as far as God leads us, and we keep going until God takes us to that next step. And God does provide, but not in the ways that we would expect. I would not expect a brave man such as Elijah to have to hide himself out. Again, it wasn't out of fear, but he was supposed to he hid out by himself. And the Bible says that God used, do you remember what God used to provide him food? Do you remember those birds that he used? Tell me, do you remember? Ravens, that's right. God used ravens. Scavengers is what they were. He used ravens to come and bring Elijah food. Now, I have my opinion. I don't know about you, but I've got my opinion. In my opinion, and it's just speculation, I just picture those ravens going right to King Ahab's house and Jezebel's house. And as soon as the baker lays that food on the table, those birds come in. Birds come in. Now, of course, if it was meatloaf, the birds would keep on flying till the good food came on the table there. But regardless, that's opinion anyway. Okay, but I just picture the birds picking up that food from Ahab's table and bringing it right to Elijah. But you know what? It may not have, at least every day, or a lot of days, it may not have been like that. It may have just been some day or two old bread. Probably, if I'm just going to go this for, it probably wasn't all the highfalutin food that you might think of. I think it was quality. I think it took care of Elijah. I think it was good in coming from the hand of God. But it probably wasn't his preference. In fact, I remember when I was a sophomore in college especially, I can remember a change that happened inside of me. When I was a kid, we used to, I think I was pretty spoiled and pampered with different foods that were made. I make fun of my nieces. My mother used to take out, I had to eat some vegetables, but most I didn't have to there. And there were certain dishes, and she made specifically what her family liked. When you get to college, I don't know about you, what colleges you've been to, but they don't come to you and say, hey, now tell me what food you like, and we're going to forget all the other students. We're going to specifically make the food that you like the best that you can make it. No. You go there, and it's the highest quality grade B chicken that money can buy. You know, whatever it is. It's this nice chicken sandwich, and you go there today and hope you like sloppy joes because that's what they're having that day. And it was amazing that all this bunch of different food, and I like sloppy joes. There's something wrong with if you don't like sloppy joes, but there's a bunch of different food that they had out there, even for me as a northerner. Now, I don't know, maybe West Virginians are a little bit different. But to me, I was used to oatmeal. I wasn't used to that white thing. It's that white little small. You know what those are called? It's not oatmeal, but it's grits. That's right. I wasn't used to grits. But I want you to know something. Although I saw that grits there and think, well, I'm not eating it. Well, when that's part of the only food that you got, well, I guess I'm going to eat it. You know what I found? Praise the Lord. Grits are awesome. I love grits. I love that. There, even if I go to Cracker Barrel today and I'm getting breakfast, I want to make sure they give me grits. There's probably still something wrong with me since I don't eat biscuits and gravies a lot, but so that my preacher friends tell me. But I like grits, and I found out at that college that there was a number of things that I didn't eat that I started just really expanding my palate, and it's amazing that I've gone over countries along so many countries in this world that I've been to. Israel, Kenya, different places in Europe, Australia, Mexico, Bahamas, a number of different places I go that I specifically now look, what's their specialty dish? I want to try something new, something different. Because I realized that just because it was something I wasn't used to, this could be something that's good. Now, it's not always been that way every time, different dishes I've tried. Most of the time it has. And I just want to bring that out, is what's it got to do with this? Is that I bet it wasn't stuff Elijah was always used to, that the ravens brought to him. Because he wasn't in charge of it. He just had to eat what was given to him. And it was a way that he hadn't expected. He was going to a place, hiding out, with birds that he would not have chosen. I would have, if I were writing the Bible, you know what I would have said? I would have commanded doves. But that's not what God said. He chose ravens. And God can use the most unlikeliest of people, unlikeliest of circumstances to provide for us because God does not fit in our little box that I tend to think he can fit in. He doesn't ever disobey his word. We can count on God to be faithful to his word, but not our script, not our guesses, not our ideas of who he is. You remember again, and I think I just want to focus on Elijah tonight when I think about these Levites. With Elijah, he not only got food from ravens, but God provided for Elijah in a way that I would not expect also. Do you remember what happened that after Elijah got those food from that ravens? After he got food from the ravens, eventually that stopped because of a small little brook that eventually dried up. Now, if it was me, I would have waited. I would have been nervous, just like Elijah. I'd have watched that brook get smaller and smaller and smaller and be thinking, Lord, I'm not sure if you're paying attention, but this brook is getting smaller, and I've only got so much water left. I get up that next morning, and it's even smaller, and I say, okay, Lord, you say the effectual fervent prayer of a righteous man. I'd be praying, and I say, okay, I'd spend time in prayer, and then again the next morning, the brook's even smaller. Are you paying attention here, Lord? What's going on? And eventually he gets up one day, And that brook is not just smaller, but it's completely dried up. That's what the word the Bible uses. It was dried up. And it was right then that God said, now go. I want you to go to Zarephath. And I not only want you to go to Zarephath, which is outside of Israel, I want you to go to a widow. And I've commanded her to sustain you and to provide for you. Wait a minute, what happened? No more ravens, no more that brook that God had. It was a specific place that God brought him to, but now God is going to bring him to another place. God's still providing, but a different means, a different tool. And when I think about God's provision, this is a part of the Christian life that you and I need. I need it, you need it, but that none of us, if we're just going to be honest, we don't like it. We don't like to see that source that we're getting something from dry up. And now that source that we've been getting certain provision, maybe not just physical or financial, but emotional, whatever it is, spiritually even, now it's not there anymore. And now it's another source that we're going to have to get from. And I think about this, not one of us likes that. But I'm going to go so far as to say, if God did this for Elijah, and he did it over and over in different people's lives in the Bible, that he does it for us too. That it happens in all of our lives if we're believers. That God at a time will dry up a certain source, a certain resource, if you will. But God's not done yet. And God will brought Elijah over to a place he never wanted to go outside of Israel. To a person he did not want to go to. That's a widow. And do you remember that? Do you remember what the widow, as she was gathering there, and she was taking the last meal she had. I don't mean meal, I mean flour. She was taking the last bit of flour that she had and preparing just a cake. I'm not talking about birthday cake. It was just something that they would bake, leavened or unleavened. It was some type of bakery item that she'd make for her and her son and said, this is going to be our last meal. And Elijah gets there just as she's about to make her last meal. Lest you think it was just happening to Elijah. Somewhere even outside of Israel. God is taking this woman who's getting her last meal. And Elijah says to her, make a cake for me before you feed yourself. She says to him, but this is the last we have. And he gives her a promise. This is someone outside of Israel. And so I would imagine this would have to be a difficult thing for her to believe. She'd have to have some type of knowledge about the God of Israel to believe this. As Elijah says, the barrel of meal will not waste. It won't be over with. You're going to have plenty of meal. You're going to have plenty of oil. It'll be plenty. But you know what? When the Bible says that Elijah was provided for, and she gave that cake to Elijah, after that, the Bible says that the barrel of meal, it did not waste. That's a wonderful thing, but it never said that that barrel of meal went to the top again and that it was full. It could have always still been at that very bottom. And they go back, and there it is at that very bottom again. And every time they went there, there was just if I can say this, a daily portion available. And they would get their daily bread. And I just want to bring this out. I'm starting this evening. We'll probably continue it again next Sunday. And I want to give Jordan Smith there on Wednesday his opportunity. But if I could just say this, if I can say this about these Levites and about Elijah, God uses the most unlikeliest of circumstances. But if we're willing to follow him, and I mean all the way. I don't mean perfect. I do not mean that we say, you know what, boy, I've got to somehow just not make mistakes today. No, we can make plenty of mistakes. David did, and God still said he was a man after his own heart. God still used him as somebody that was the example, the standard for kings. And he made plenty of mistakes. Abraham made plenty of mistakes, but was brought out as a man of faith. It just means that we believe in a strong God. We want to go forward towards him. So if I just bring this out as I'm going through these examples, when I think of these Levites, I'd have to put myself in their position if I'm seeing that storehouse is now being given to Tobiah. That means the high priest himself is now going outside of God's will. But what do I do? Do I follow him? My supply is being diminished. I don't have the storehouse there. That's being given to Tobiah. Elisha gave that to Tobiah. What do I do? Well, if God has called me here, how can I go somewhere else? And I want to say this to you as, if I can just call you Levites, if you would. I'm giving a broad brush, I understand that. But if I say this, if you want to be all out for God, serve him not just in your church, but outside of your church. God still provides that. I don't want to even say this, but even when I fail, God doesn't. Even if I were to go wrong, God doesn't. Even if your role models in your life go wrong, God doesn't. He's still faithful. He'll still provide. And I think about what Elijah went to, every circumstance that he came into, ways that God provided that he would not expect. But he said, Lord, I'm still your prophet. If you want me to go to Zarephath, if you want me to hide, if you want to go to Zarephath, if you want me to eat from ravens, a widow taking her last meal, then Lord, I'll do that. God still provides. Do we trust?